Now, at this point, I'm going to bring in some stuff about change management and how people react to change. That is based on a metaphor that was originally stated by Jonathan Haidt. And he talks about the fact, according to modern psychological thinking, that we have two independent systems operating in our brain at the same time. One of those systems is our rational mind, where we as people, as human beings, think about things from a rational decision-making kind of perspective, the objective side of things, if you will. And the other is the emotional side of our brains, which tends to be by far the most powerful part of our minds. And the metaphor, the analogy that Haidt uses is, he calls the emotional side of things, the instinctive, the pain and pleasure side of things. He says this is the elephant. And our rational side is a rider on the elephant. So the rider is steering the elephant. And the reason that this is a useful metaphor is, how many of you have ever ridden a horse or some other kind of animal? Right? I grew up on a farm, so I grew up riding horses and things like that. And I've ridden horses that had not been trained. And it was an interesting experience, I can tell you. I still have the bruises from some of those encounters. And the reality is that when you're riding an animal that is 10 times bigger than you are, you have a limited amount of actual control over what that animal is going to do. When you're talking about an elephant, the rider seems to be the one in control. The rider has the reins and is given the directions. But if that elephant decides to go that way when the rider wants to go that way, guess who wins? And so our rational, conscious mind that tries to make good decisions, when it comes to that primitive emotional underpinnings, the primitive side of our brain tends to win when there is a conflict between those. Now, this is something that I think most of us intuitively understand, but that instinctive part of us is something that we have to address if we're going to be successful in making change happen. The emotional side of us as human beings cares more about the short term than the long term. So when you want to make a short-term sacrifice in order to get some long-term gain, because you have some rational objective that you want to achieve, the elephant is down there feeling the pain in the short term and says, I don't want to do that. I won't eat that box of candy. No. Everybody knows that you should exercise more, that you should eat less in order to lose weight, right? But I don't want to exercise, I want to eat a pound of chocolate. Because that's the short-term thing. Now, the long-term thing from a rational, objective perspective is, for our long-term health, we should eat a reasonable amount, we should exercise. And if I have that rational discussion with you, you would probably all agree with that, right? And for those of you who are skinny, you would probably say, I do not understand why you can't do a better job of doing what I diet. So there are other analogies you could use. If you are a smoker, smoking is bad for you. Quit. Think that's the rational thing to do. Is anybody had that discussion with a family member or a friend who was a smoker? I have an aunt who smokes like a chimney. The only thing that limits the number of cigarettes that she smokes every day is the money that she has in her purse. And we've had conversations repeatedly over the years. You should stop smoking. She says, Mark, I'm older than you and I'll do whatever I want to do. I like to smoke. I'm never going to win that discussion. Now, I know that, but I still engage in it periodically just because I like to give a brief. No. But the reality is that rational decision, you should stop smoking, you should go on a diet, you should exercise more. All of these things that we may say, this would make our lives better. When push comes to shove, it's the emotional side that we have to get aligned with that long-term vision, or the change is not likely to happen. When change fails, it's usually the element. It's not that we've said, no, that's a decision, that's not a path we want to go from a rational perspective. It's because emotionally, we want that short-term gratification, and the elephant does not have that long-term view. If you want change to happen, the rider has got to keep the elephant on the path until we reach the destination. Now, the Heaths have written a book called Switch, which uses this metaphor to drive a lot of discussion of techniques that one can use in making change happen. And so what I'm going to do is go through a number of the different observations that they make. And we have to realize that getting our emotional side, the elephant, buying into the change is crucial to making things happen, because the elephant, the emotional side, is the one that actually gets things done. The rider has the weaknesses of the intellectual thinker, which is that the NTs, remember the discussion of the NTs? They tend to get stuck into overanalyzing, they tend to overthink things. That's the weakness of the thinkers. And so if you want things to happen, the rider has to say, this is where we're going, this is the plan. Then the elephant has to provide the energy. Our emotional side has to provide the energy in order to propel that change forward. And so this is a useful metaphor. And one of the things that we have to be aware of is the fact that our self-control is an exhaustible resource. We can run out of self-control. There's only a limited amount of it that we have available. Now, I keep talking about going on a diet. When I go to the grocery store with my wife, and we walk past the candy aisle, I would like to buy some chocolate, because I like chocolate. But the first time that I go by the candy aisle, I can say, nope, I'm not going to buy any chocolate. I don't need to buy any candy. I'm going to go on by. The second time that we come by the candy aisle, I look over there and say, oh, those chocolate-covered almonds look awful good. But no, I'm going to exercise some good self-control, and I'll keep walking. The third time we're swinging by, I tell my wife, I'm going to go ahead and look at some things, and I go visit the candy aisle, and I'll buy a pound of chocolate almonds. If I only walk past it one time, I could get out without buying, without addressing any of my vices. I could keep from buying the chocolate almonds. But I like chocolate almonds, and if you keep throwing temptation in front of me, then my self-control will eventually snap, and I will succumb to that particular vice. When we are doing change, it's hard. And our natural tendency is to follow the status quo. And so if we keep putting the temptations in front of ourselves, if we keep saying, giving ourselves all of the opportunities to follow the status quo, and say, no, I need to do things differently now. If I'm continuing to work at making the change every time that I come to a decision point related to the change, then eventually I'm going to tend to fall into the old way of doing things. So what are some of the things that I can do that will help me exercise that self-control, that will keep me from exhausting my self-control? So there's this three-part framework that the Heaths talk about. They talk about directing the rider. The rider is the rational part of the system. And so if we want to make change happen, we have to be very clear. We have to remove the ambiguities that may exist in what the objective is and what our plan is for achieving those objectives if we are going to be successful. And that's from the rational perspective. We have to motivate the element. In other words, we've got to engage our emotional side in following through with this change management effort. As a consultant, I work with organizations that want to grow their organizational maturity many times. And they want to be a level 3 or a level 4 organization against the capability maturity model or CMMI. And their objective is to be level 3, or to be level 4, or to be level 5. And what I tell them is that's a horrible objective. Now, I kind of wrote the model. So, I help to define what those levels are, and I'll tell you, being a level 4 organization is a horrible objective. Because when you talk to the people in the trenches who do the day-to-day work of the organization, it is very hard to get the elephant aligned with, let's be a level 4 organization. That doesn't motivate the emotional side of us as software professionals. What I've got to do is I've got to express the things that underlie what being a level 4 organization is. I've got to talk about things that you might care about as a software professional. I've got to talk about things like we need to build high-quality products because I take personal pride in doing high-quality work. I have to talk about we want to make our unhappy customers happy because I want my customers to be happy with my work. I want to increase our productivity. No, because I take pride in being a productive worker. Being level 4, okay, that's your objective. That's not something I care about. So what are the things that I care about? What are the things that are going to motivate y'all? Because just saying, we need to be a level 4 in order to get more business, that's not going to motivate the emotional side of this. That's too long term. That is not an emotional appeal. That's just a logical appeal. And then lastly, shaping the path. And by the path, what these are talking about is the environment. What are the things that we can do to set the environment in a way that supports the changes that we want to occur? And there are a number of specific things that we can do in each one of these areas. And what I'm going to do until lunch, and then we'll come back and we will continue this discussion after lunch, is talk about some of the specific things that you can do to direct the rider, to motivate the elephant, and to shape the path that will make change more likely to occur. One of the things from a directing the rider perspective that is enormously powerful is to find the bright spots. Now, what's a bright spot? A bright spot is something that shows what is working today. Now, I can give you a big problem, and we were working with an organization back a number of years ago whose customer had said, you're doing a really lousy job of building this particular kind of application, and we're going to replace you with somebody else that can build good software. So they were motivated to change, to address their problems. And they did a process assessment, and they identified over 50 major problems with how they were currently building that particular kind of product. Over 50 different things that they could do. And 50 is an overwhelming number. And so this is one of those true but useless things. It's true, but it doesn't help us solve the problem. We got 50-something, that's just overwhelming. It may be true, but 50, way too many. What they did was they said, if we got problem number one, does anybody in our company know how to solve this problem? So this was a particular business unit within a big multinational company, and they started asking their colleagues in other units, do you have a solution for this particular problem? And they systematically went through the problems, and what they found was every single problem that they had identified, somebody in their company had solved. And so they went off and they found solutions. They found bright spots, and they brought those solutions into their division. And within a year, they had become the preferred provider by their customer for that particular application. That was a complete turnaround, 180-degree turnaround. And what they had done was they had found the things that were working. They said, let's look for the things that work and let's steal those ideas. And that will help us to address the problems. Being solutions focused. What is it that will help us to understand or to realize that this problem has been solved? And there's two different specific techniques that you can use here. One is called the miracle question. What if overnight a miracle occurred and the problem went away? What is the first sign that you would see that things were different, that the problem was gone? In your day-to-day work, what is the first thing? If you have this problem, is there something that you would see in your day-to-day work that would be an indicator that this problem has gone away, that a miracle has occurred? Once I start knowing what the indicators are that the problem has gone, I can start asking, well, what are the things that I can do to make those particular signals start popping up? Because they're going to help me start chipping away at the underlying problem. A related question, the exception question. Have you ever seen an indication that that miracle occurred? Some small sign, even if it's just for a short time, that for some small period of time, that a particular problem is not an issue, just for a little bit of time. What was that thing that said, oh, maybe there's light at the end of the tunnel? But sometimes, what we're looking for is, what are the behavioral indicators of the problem? Ultimately, what we're going for is a series of small solutions that, as we aggregate them, help to solve the big problem. Because the big problem may be overwhelming. But if I can start chipping away at the big problems with a lot of small solutions, then small solutions compound. Have y'all heard the phrase Kaizen? It's a Japanese word. It says, if we want to do continual improvement, instead of trying to make a revolutionary change that will do everything in one fell swoop, do small solutions, do lots and lots of small solutions every day, find something that we can do, just an incrementally better solution, and lots of small improvements will compound to create a big improvement. So would you rather have evolutionary change in small pieces that continues along, or would you rather say, okay, we're going to solve all our problems by going to Agile? Obviously, Agile methods are going to be the solution, and so we're going to stop building software using the traditional methods, and everybody is going to move to Agile on, what is today, December the 17th? On January the 1st, everybody's doing Agile. We're all moving to extreme programming. New methodology, right? It's going to solve all our problems. How many of you think that throwing everything that you've done away from a methodology perspective and starting on something new is really going to solve all your problems? Yeah, without that. I like Agile methods. I work with companies that want to adopt Agile methods. And I go in and I train teams. And they do pilots. And they say, we're going to try this out and we're going to find out what works, and we're going to gradually start rolling Agile methods into our organization where they make sense. But my experience with big bang changeovers, with business process re-engineering, is that they are high risk. And so you try to come up with a big solution to a big problem. Sometimes it works, sometimes it's an absolute disaster. Small changes are low risk and can incrementally compound on one another. Script the critical moves. There's a lot of uncertainty associated with change. We've got new ways of doing things, new approaches that are coming in. And when there is uncertainty, our emotional side wants to stay with the status quo. We don't like uncertainty. We like the comfortable, the familiar, even when the status quo has its deficiencies. It has the familiarity of comfort. Have any of you ever heard the phrase, better the devil you know than the devil you don't? Don't know how much of that particular saying basically says, I know we've got trouble now, but if we change, who knows what kinds of new problems we will have. We have a known problem now, and if we change, we'll have new problems, and we don't have any idea of how bad the new problems are going to be. It's better to stay with the problems that we currently have, because we know those. They're familiar. So if the elephant is going along and there's uncertainty about the new path, the elephant wants to stay with the status quo. That's the default path. So if we're going to change things, then we have to be crisp. We've got to make very clear statements. We've got to avoid uncertainty and ambiguity. And that means that we've got to set behavioral goals rather than noble abstract goals. So, if you want to decrease the number of defects in your software, that's a noble goal, right? Something that you would probably all say, yeah, it's really good. What behaviors are you going to change in order to have fewer defects in your software? I'm a fan of peer reviews or inspections, as you know. So one of the things that I might say is to put inspections in place. Do you inspect everything starting out? Well, that's maybe a noble goal also. We have to break things down into smaller and smaller pieces and then say, this is exactly how we're going to do it. So we're going to start with code inspections. How do we do code inspections? How do we script the addition of this new technique into our day-to-day programming work? What are the expectations? What training are we going to provide to people? What tools are we going to make available to them? What job aids, what procedures, what checklists are we going to provide to them that will smooth this path out, that will script that this change is one that we're going to be following. And the more uncertainty that you have about this new inspections process, then the more challenging it's going to be for you to get the emotional involvement, the impetus to go forward with it. So one of the things that we have to do is to script out what the behavioral things that we're going to do are on a day-to-day basis. One of the techniques that we can use is to point to the destination with something called the destination postcard. What is it that we want to achieve in the near term within what we can see? From the writer's perspective, from the rational perspective, we want to know the direction that we're headed. From the elephant's perspective, we want to know why this journey is worthwhile. There was a teacher who started teaching the first grade, and she was hired in a school that had a lot of poor people going to school. They had lots of challenges in terms of some of the educational circumstances that they found themselves in. And what she said to her students is, you're going to be third graders by the time you finish the first grade. Third graders. You're going to be able to do third grade work by the time that you are at the end of the first grade. Now, as it turns out, the educational standards, the bar in the educational system in the U.S. is not terribly high. And so, learning to do third grade level work is not actually an overwhelming task. So what she done was she had set a destination postcard in front of her students. And this is something that got the kids excited. We're going to be third graders. I mean, we're in the first grade. We're going to be third graders. And she got the kids excited about the idea of learning. That they were going to acquire skills that none of the other kids had. They were going to be third graders. And so, addressing the long-term educational goals, what she was doing is saying, in my class with these kids, what I can do is I can lay out a path that over the course of the next few months, we're going to put in place a set of skills and techniques, do some things that will build the ability of our students to do things that are far ahead of what their expectations for themselves might have been before we got into this class. What is the destination postcard that talks about what we can achieve in the near-term future in our software process improvement? Being a level 5 organization, that's not very motivating in the first place. What is the thing that we can claim is our destination in terms of what we want to achieve in the next 6 months, in the next year, within the near term? Not where we want to be 5 years from now. What is it that we want to do this year? One of the objectives that I talk about that high maturity organizations are pieces of that can be done in organizations of any maturity level, and that is to act on suggestions on how we can do things better. How many organizations have suggestion boxes? Whether you call them process improvement proposals or whatever, who are the people who know best where the problems are in the way you build software? It's the people who are building software today, right? Ask those people, what could we do better? And the challenge that I put before organizations, that level 5 organizations have to solve, is that in an organization with 300 or 400 software engineers perhaps, you will address 90% of the process improvement proposals within 5 working days. Now, when I am looking at the data, if you have 10 process improvement proposals per engineer per year, that's actually a pretty conservative estimate. But what you're saying there is that you're going to get 3,000 or 4,000 process improvement proposals, 3,000 or 4,000 suggestions about how we could build software better. And you're going to implement 90% of them within 5 days of getting them. Does that sound overwhelming? That is actually quite aggressive, and yet I've seen organizations do exactly that. What's the picture postcard? We are going to act on your suggestions. We're going to put a real system of doing these incremental improvements, these Kaizen kind of improvements, and we're going to close them out. We're going to address them. We're going to do whatever is needed to address this particular issue. We're going to get it done in 5 days. Is that doable? Not easy, is it? But it is surprising the number of changes that we say cannot be done, but when you actually look at it, it turns out quite within our grasp. Watts Humphrey was working with an organization back in the late 80s doing process improvement. And we had gone in and done a process assessment, and there were a number of findings that came out of things that needed to be changed. He was doing the briefing to the colonel who was in charge of the organization. And he's made a comment about, this particular finding right here, you need to address this particular issue. And the colonel said, we cannot do that. It would take an act of Congress to address that problem. You know what Watts said? He said, I'm going to be in D.C. next week. I'll stop by the Pentagon and find out who we need to talk about in Congress to get this addressed. Watts retired as the vice president at IBM in charge of all commercial software development. He was kind of senior, way above my pay grade. He knew senators. He knew high-level politicians. So you tell him it's going to take an act of Congress. Fine, I'll go down to Congress and talk about getting that issue taken care of. And the colonel said, oh, wait a second. Let us look at this in a little bit more detail before you start talking to senators about my problem. Because you don't want, if you're a colonel, you do not want senators talking to the generals about your problems. That's just not one of those things that is conducive to career advancement. And so Watts said, fine, I'll talk to you on Monday. And we'll see what the best way to go forward is. And so we gave a call on Monday, and the colonel said, it turns out that we don't really need an act of Congress. In fact, we've already fixed the problem. But a lot of times, we look at situations and we say, this is going to take a huge investment. And a lot of times there are things that we can do that will help us to get started in addressing that problem that are much smaller in nature. It doesn't always take an act of Congress. Now maybe sometimes it does. In which case it helps to have somebody who knows senators in your hip pocket. What is the destination? Where is it that we want to go? Let's start thinking about, what is it that we want to get to in the short term? It's going to motivate the elephant in terms of getting that emotional side engaged. And it's kind of interesting. It's going to take an act of Congress. All of a sudden, we've got this problem addressed. We're capable of changing. We're capable of getting this journey started. And that can be very motivating. Find the people. My bias is towards change is you analyze what the problem is, you think about it, come up with a solution, and you make a change. The reality is that successful changes are based more on see a problem, feel the pain, and then change. That's the emotional as opposed to the rational side of things. Now the problem that you run into in there is when you're doing self-evaluation, when you're doing this analyze, think, change kind of cycle, is that the elephant tends to interpret things in the most positive kind of a way. And so, for example, I have students who occasionally will come to me and say, I didn't get a fair grade in your class. You gave me a C, and I am much smarter than that. If you were a better teacher, you could have taught me this topic. So it's all your fault, that you weren't a better teacher in teaching me how to do this. No, the elephant tends to say, oh, I didn't have a good teacher, the textbook was badly written, there's all kinds of reasons. No, I just didn't I am capable of doing this work, I just didn't get engaged with it. And so we interpret the things that happen around us from a positive perspective. Maybe nobody else puts that rosy interpretation on things, but when we're doing self-evaluation, we tend to put our rose-colored glasses on and do a positive interpretation of what happened. This is normal human tendency. We take a positive view of what we have done and what, we want to think that we are capable, competent people. And so we tend to view things from a feeling kind of perspective. Can I get the emotional side engaged in seeing the problem, feeling the pain, driving the change? That's where the change happens in. When I do the think, analyze kind of stuff, I'm going to have this tendency, this bias, towards coming up with a rationalization, with a justification, that there's not a real problem here. This is, there were other factors that came into play. This project would have come along just fine if the customer wasn't changing the requirements all the time. This project would have worked out just fine if we didn't have a fixed price contract. And so, the contracts guys, messed us up right at the very beginning. We come up with all these rationalizations that make us feel good about ourselves, that are rosy interpretations of the reality, rather than saying, we have got to change the system because of the pain that it has caused. Last one, and then we will break for lunch. And this one is actually one that's pretty controversial. The Dead Snowball is a technique that was developed by some financial consultants. They worked with families that had gotten into financial trouble, borrowed too much money, had a lot of debt, and so they'd come in and they'd talk to these financial consultants. And what they found was that the best decision from an economic perspective did not work to change the problem. From an economic perspective, you should look at all of your debts and you should attack the ones that have the highest interest associated with them, right? Because the more interest that you're no longer having to pay, the better off you are in terms of financial well-being. So from an economist's perspective, you look at your biggest problems and you address those first. What these financial advisors said was, no, look at your smallest debt. Pay off your smallest debt, which economically doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But when you pay off your smallest debt, you got a debt paid off. You have one fewer debt to worry about, and that makes you feel good. And every time that you pay off a debt, you have more capital to apply to the next debt in the sequence. And so as you pay off the smallest debt, and then the next smallest debt, and then the next smallest debt, you get a snowball kind of effect going where success builds on success, builds on success. John Wooden is a famous college basketball coach in the U.S. He retired many years ago, but back in the 1960s, he was famous. He was the coach at UCLA, and over a period of, I think, 10 years, UCLA won the National Basketball Championship 8 times, something like that. He won more national championships in basketball than anyone had ever won before or since. So he was like, the basketball coach. And he said, when you improve a little bit each day, eventually big things occur. So this is that Kaizen idea, popping up again. Don't look for the quick, big improvement. Seek the small improvement one day at a time. That's the only way it happens, and when it happens, relax. So what he said, and what that snowball says, is look for small wins that are, 1, meaningful, and 2, within immediate reach. So rather than trying for the big solution to your problems, get something that is meaningful, it's something that you care about, And it's something that you can do today. It's not something that's going to take you 2 years or 3 years to get done. It's something you can do today that you care about, that will have an impact. Do that one, and then do the next one, and then do the next one. Do the small things and see those things start compounding in terms of their effect. Now, notice that a lot of this stuff is going back to the idea of the Dead Snowball, the shrinking the change, scripting the critical moves. All of this stuff goes back to the idea, do small things. You've got a suggestion box that says, come in and do some simple little thing, and you would have said, that's not a big deal. That's okay. Do the little bitty things. Do the little things that will make life easier. I was involved at Carnegie Mellon with an improvement program, and one of the things that we identified as a big, annoying issue, but it was actually a very small change that needed to be made, was we wanted to get reimbursed for our travel expenses. And it was taking 6 to 8 weeks to process a travel reimbursement request. And when you're, a poor academic, waiting 2 months to get your travel expenses reimbursed is kind of a big deal. Especially when you're making a dozen trips a year. You may be in, I spent 4 weeks in India one time doing some work with Indian companies. If I come back and I have to wait 2 more months to get reimbursed for the thousands of dollars that I spent, my wife is going to be unhappy with me. Right? So we basically said, one of the things that would really have an impact on our lives is to shorten this reimbursement. And we basically said, this is a problem, and this is a bureaucracy thing, this is a paper-pushing thing, and they cut it down to under 2 weeks. And it didn't take a huge change, but in terms of making us happier, being able to get your travel expenses addressed within a couple of weeks was a huge change. I can get my expenses reimbursed before my next paycheck comes out. That's a big win. From my perspective, a small win, but meaningful. A win that turned out to be an immediate reach. Once they decided to fix that problem, it took less than a month. It actually took about 2 weeks. Because it was all bureaucracy. It was all paper pushing. And once they decided, once the powers that be decided to fix it, it got fixed. Meaningful, and something that could be done quickly once the decision was made to address it. But it was identifying that there was an issue and then deciding that it should be addressed that was the critical. One of the other things that we can talk about is growing your people in terms of how they make decisions. There are 2 different models of decision making that may be helpful in thinking about what become automatic kinds of decisions. One is based on consequences, and we can consider this kind of a prototype of the rational decision-making approach. This is the kind of approach that I would tend to follow because it's look at the criteria, come up with the trade-offs, look at the consequences. It's a very thinking-oriented kind of an approach. But in terms of getting the emotional side, getting the elephant actively participating in the decision, the identity model is one that may be appealing, which is that you look at decisions from the perspective of who am I as a software professional. In the situation that I face at this particular point in time, what would the kind of person that I am or that I want to be do in this particular situation. And when you express decisions from the perspective of our self-image, our identity as perhaps a software professional, then it makes a lot of the decisions that might otherwise be challenging relatively straightforward. So, for example, as a software professional, am I comfortable with releasing software that I do not consider to be ready for release? Now, from a consequences perspective, I would say, okay, there are pluses and minuses to releasing this software. It's going to have lots of defects. What's the anticipated failure rate? You know, you go through a series of trade-offs and consequences, and you try and come up with a rational decision about whether or not you are ready. From the identity perspective, you say, would a competent, respected software professional release software like this? And the consequences model gets the thinking side of my brain engaged, but the identity model gets the emotional side, because this is talking about my identity as a software professional. And so, to the degree that we find that a useful and valuable way to cast the decision-making process, this is the kind of framework that it can be useful to express these kinds of things in. Now, that is not to say that there are not trade-offs that one might have to make. So, take that example of is the software ready for release? No, you might say, we have 5,000 known defects in this product. Should we release it? And you might decide to release it based upon an analysis of the pros and cons associated with releasing the software. And that's a rational decision-making process that you're going through. Would you come to that same decision if you said, as a responsible software professional, would I release software that has 5,000 known defects? If I don't give you any context, your answer might well be no. Windows NT was released with 5,000 known defects. How many of you were working with Windows systems when Windows NT came out? 1, 2, 3, 4. Most of you were working. My experience with Windows was that Windows was not a very good operating system. It was not very reliable. In fact, Windows ME was so bad that when Les Hatton was doing an analysis of the reliability of different operating systems, he did not put Windows ME on the chart that compared to different operating systems, including multiple versions of Windows. And I asked him, after he gave a talk on this, why Windows ME was not listed, and he said the reliability was so bad it skewed all of the graphs, made them look bad. Which I bought my wife a Windows ME system, and so the mean time to failure was less than a day. So I heard about the problems with Windows ME on a regular basis. Windows NT was a far better operating system, a far better version of Windows than any of the previous versions of Windows. The decision to release Windows NT with 5,000 known defects was a good decision. And it was a good decision from both the consequences and the identity perspectives. The consequences, we are going to have a real professional version of Windows. Now, Windows NT was the first truly professional version of Windows, and it was head and shoulders above all the prior versions. Now, I have my problems with subsequent releases of Windows, but they aren't reliability problems. They're design decisions that Microsoft has made that I don't like. And in fact, I moved to a Mac when Windows Vista came out, because I said, I do not like what they've done when Windows Vista. I've made some decisions I disagree with, and I'm just going to go ahead and switch over to a Mac. But I am not particularly concerned about the reliability of different releases of Windows today. When you work with Windows in the 1990s, the early 1990s, mid 1990s, it was not a terribly reliable operating system. And that was a problem. So deciding to release Windows NT with 5,000 known defects is good from a rational perspective. And if I had worked at Microsoft at the time, I can see myself saying, we have got to get a better version of Windows out there, and as a responsible software professional, I want to get this out there. Those 5,000 defects are still an order of magnitude better than all the prior versions. So I would have found that my identity would have supported that kind of a decision. But you've got to frame it in terms of the context so that you understand why I would make that decision in that kind of a situation. You have to understand what the situation was. So using the identity model is a way of getting your emotional side engaged with the decisions and following through on them. And one of the reasons that you want to get this emotional commitment to the decision is because any project has its challenges along the way. There's a company called IDEO in the U.S. They're famous for being a professional design company. They're probably the best known design company in the U.S. They do a lot of work with Apple and other big software organizations, as well as other kinds of businesses. And they talk about the project mood chart. They're working with on a new project. You start off with hope. And at the end of the project, you hope to have confidence in the product that you've come up with, the design that you've come up with. But between those two peaks, there's an area of challenges where you develop insight into what the problems are. And it's a U-shape there because, things are not as optimistic as you're going through the trough. When you're going through the valley, things are looking pretty rocky, and then hopefully you make the upward turn until eventually you have achieved the confidence that you've built or designed a good product. But their expectation is there are going to be failures along the way. And the question is, will I maintain my vision, my energy, and continue the journey of working through the project when I have challenges, when I have failures? In the design world, when we look back after a project is finished, you say, okay, here's the design process, went straight from A to B. But when you go back and you actually look at how things happen, you tried things out, you found things that failed, you tried something else, maybe that worked, maybe it didn't. And so it was a little bit more circuitous of a path that you took. Where in retrospect, you look back and you say, oh, you go from A to B to C to D, and it looks like a more rational, a more linear kind of a process. But there are opportunities to learn things about how the system needs to be designed to address the issues in the real design process. Tweaking the environment. What can we do in the environment that will make the right decisions better and the wrong decisions harder? I've used this example of losing weight several times because I've struggled with weight for years now. And over the last couple of years, I've actually lost some weight. I mean, it may be hard to tell, but I've actually lost some weight in the last couple of years. And one of the techniques that I have used, that I read about in a magazine somewhere, and I said, I think I'll try this, called plate control. When we bought our china, we've got little bitty plates, we've got medium-sized plates, and we've got the big dinner plates. And when you get a plate to eat your dinner, you get the big dinner plate down, and you fill it up, and you eat all the food on it. If you pick a smaller plate, pick one of the medium-sized plates, you can't put as much food on it. And so you fill the plate up and you eat, and you use that as an environmental tweak that will help you to say, I have had enough food, and you emotionally feel, yes, this is enough food. I've mentioned a couple of times eating a pound of chocolate almonds. I have done that. You get a pound box of chocolate almonds, and you sit down in front of the television, and you start eating chocolate almonds. And what you'll find is, by the end of the evening, you've eaten a pound of chocolate almonds. This may not be something any of you can do, but I've done this more than once. Okay? What plate control says, extend this idea, is take some of those chocolate almonds and put them in a bowl, and take the bowl with you, and when you get through eating that portion, you're done. And what you'll find is that's enough to satisfy your craving for sweets. And so I can make a pound of chocolate almonds last for a week easily. I just eat a relatively small amount every evening when I'm watching TV. And that works. And I've been able to lose, a fair amount of weight over the past couple of years. And that's one of the techniques that I have adopted in doing that. So environmentally, if I have that box of candy in front of me, it's very hard for me to say, okay, I've eaten as much as I should put the lid back on and put it back on the shelf. But if I have a small portion, then I get through with it, I'm finished, I'm sitting on the couch, the candy is in the kitchen. It's relatively easy for me to say, okay, I'm just going to continue watching TV, I'm not going to go get a second serving of the candy. This is an environmental thing. It makes the right behavior easier. It makes the wrong behavior a little bit harder. It makes it a little bit easier for me to exercise my self-control. That's one of the techniques that I can use. Now, in the software field, what are the things that we can do to change the environment to make the wrong behavior harder, to make the right behavior, the change that we want to put in place, a little bit easier? Now, we can talk about defining processes and putting tools into place, but do the tools help us to implement the process that we want to follow? How many of us have bought tools from vendors that were not aligned with the way we actually wanted to implement a job? Have you done that? And that's a case where the environment, the tool that you have acquired, does not support the right behaviors. It actually may influence you to follow some of the wrong behaviors. So getting tools that are aligned with the processes that we want to follow is one of the things that can help us do some environmental tweaks. A related topic is the idea of building action triggers. We have habits. We're creatures of habit, right? Build triggers into our environment that cause us to execute a desired behavior because some event happened that triggered that behavior. Again, I will use my example of good personal habits. Like I said, if you want to lose weight, you eat less and you exercise more. So eating less, I work on plate control. That helps me to eat less. The other side of that is to exercise more. Any of you tried to put an exercise program into place? No. 20-something years ago, I used to exercise on a regular basis, and then our son was born, and all of a sudden, instead of going to the gym several times a week, my exercise program essentially disappeared. Instead of playing racquetball, I was changing diapers. I would rather have been playing racquetball, in all honesty. But, my environment changed. In recent months, my wife and I put a new habit, a new pattern into place, which is that now the action trigger that we have for going to the gym is getting out of bed. So we get out of bed and we say, hey, it's time to go to the gym. So we get over to the gym, we work out, we take a shower at the gym, get dressed, and go into work. Now, in terms of triggers, you've got to be prepared to execute this pre-planned, this preloaded decision when the time comes. And so I have another action trigger, which is I'm ready to go to bed. I've got to get my gym bag packed. I've got to have my clothes packed up so that when I get up in the morning, the gym bag is there. What action triggers do we have in our software process, in our software engineering environment? When something happens, we automatically, without any debate, do the next follow-on activity. And it's something where we have preloaded the decision. We have a habit. This is the way we do things. What are the things that you can think of in your day-to-day work where you can put in place a trigger where you said, when this happens, I will automatically do this thing. When I have finished writing a routine, I will issue the invitation to do the inspection of my module. Is that an action trigger that you could put into place? Is that one that would be supported by the environment? So the environmental tweaks, the action triggers, you have those things all set up. So you say, this is just a habit. This is just the way that we do things around here. So you get a line of, module coded or module designed or whatever. You've got the design complete. Next thing, the next step in our process is we do the design review, the code review, whatever. Now, what makes that preloaded decision occur? What's the action trigger that says, okay, and maybe it's something in the tools that you use, that you get some kind of screen that pops up. That would be an environment tweak. I check in a module, I finish coding it, and I get a screen that pops up that says, who do you want to send email to do an inspection of this particular module? No. That's a tweak to the environment that puts an action trigger in place that we will do an inspection. Now, would I do it without that trigger? Probably, maybe. But when it pops up automatically, now I've got a trigger that says, okay, it's time to do the inspection. And so I'm not thinking about it, I'm building habits. So what are the things that I can build into the environment that will help me to follow the activity that I want to follow?